Dust rose in thick clouds as two Roman armies stared at each other across the plains. August 9th, 48 BC, fields of Thessaly, Greece. The fate of Rome, of the Republic, of the known world, would be decided before noon. Julius Caesar, with barely 30,000 hungry and exhausted men, faced 45,000 fresh soldiers commanded by Pompey the Great. Enemy cavalry outnumbered his 7-1. His supply lines were cut. His legions had spent weeks eating grass and roots. Every military calculation indicated this would be his last battle, his grave. But in the next few hours, you'll see how the most brilliant tactical genius in Rome transformed desperation into a victory that would change history forever. To understand how two Romans came to kill each other on Greek soil, we need to rewind just 2 years. The Roman Republic, that system which had lasted nearly 5 centuries, was dying. Not from external invaders, but from its own internal ambitions. 3 men had ruled Rome together: Julius Caesar, Pompey the Great, and Marcus Licinius Crassus. The first triumvirate, they called it. But Crassus died in the disaster at Carrhae against the Parthians in 53 BC. Without the mediator, only 2 titans remained. And Rome wasn't big enough for both. Caesar had spent a decade conquering Gaul. From Britannia to the Rhine, he'd subdued tribes Romans considered invincible. He'd massacred millions, enslaved millions more, and become the most successful general of his generation. But more importantly, he'd forged an army that worshipped him like a god. His legions were brutal professionals who'd survived 100 battles. They didn't fight for Rome. They fought for Caesar. Pompey, on the other hand, represented the establishment. Hero of the wars against Sertorius, conqueror of the eastern Mediterranean, the man who'd eliminated pirates. At 58, he was the Senate's face, of the established order. But his glory was past. Decades since he'd personally commanded in real combat. While Caesar perfected his craft in Gaul's snows, Pompey played politics in Rome's halls. The Senate, terrified of Caesar's power, ordered him to disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen. It was an obvious trap. Without his legions, he'd be arrested, tried, probably executed. Caesar responded with the phrase that would echo through eternity. Alia iacta est. The die is cast. In January 49 BC, he crossed the Rubicon with his legions. It was capital treason. It was the start of civil war. The initial campaign was a triumph for Caesar. Italy fell almost without fighting. Pompey fled to Greece with the Senate and treasury reserves. Caesar pursued him across the Adriatic, but without naval control, his options were limited. For months, the two armies played cat and mouse in Greek territory. Caesar tried besieging Pompey at Dyrrhachium. It was a disaster. Pompey broke the siege, inflicting Caesar's first real defeat in years. The Caesarian legions, starving and demoralized, retreated into Greece's interior. By the way, this story reaches you in English, the language that connects continents and cultures from London to Lagos, from New York to New Delhi, from Sydney to Singapore. I'm curious, from which corner of the English-speaking world are you listening? America, Britain, Australia, India, Canada, South Africa? Each battle resonates differently across the lands that share this tongue. Now, Pompey had every advantage. Massive numerical superiority. 45,000 infantry against 30,000. Cavalry supremacy. 7,000 riders against Caesar's mere 1,000. Sea control and unlimited supply lines. Most important, he had allies across the eastern Mediterranean constantly sending reinforcements. Time was on his side. He just needed to wait while Caesar weakened from starvation and desertion. Pompey's generals, senatorial aristocrats who'd never dirtied their hands with real blood, were practically celebrating already. Labienus, Caesar's former subordinate who'd defected, pressed for the final attack. Caesar is finished, he insisted. His men eat grass. They have dysentery. Every day we wait, another 100 desert. Even cautious Pompey was starting to believe it. But Caesar had survived worse situations. In Gaul, he'd faced 300,000 Germans with 50,000 Romans. He'd withstood the siege of Alesia against 1,000,000 Gauls. This veteran of 1,000 combats hadn't come to die on Thessaly's plains. He had a plan. a tactical innovation so simple and so brilliant that no one in the Roman world had anticipated it. Something never seen in combat before. But what Pompey didn't know, what his arrogant generals couldn't imagine, was that they were about to face an innovation that would change warfare forever. On the Caesarian side, Julius Caesar was an unprecedented phenomenon in Roman history. At 52, he'd achieved what others only dreamed of. Born patrician but without real fortune, he'd risen through pure political and military genius. 10 years in Gaul had transformed him from ambitious politician into legendary conqueror. He'd subdued over 300 tribes. He'd crossed the Rhine and the English Channel, places Romans considered the world's edges. But his true genius wasn't brutality. It was adaptation. Caesar learned from every enemy, incorporated their tactics, innovated constantly. His legions were the ancient world's most lethal weapon. The 10th Legion, his favorite, had fought 100 battles without knowing decisive defeat. Hardened veterans who could march 30 miles in a day with full armor. Soldiers who'd faced British chariots, Germanic phalanxes, Gallic ambushes. But more important, they trusted Caesar with religious devotion. When he promised victory, they believed. That faith was worth more than 1,000 reinforcements. Facing him, Pompey Magnus represented Rome's old guard. At 58, his military career read like legend. At 23, he'd commanded armies. He'd crushed Sertorius's rebellion in Hispania. He'd cleared the Mediterranean of pirates in 3 months, a feat that seemed impossible. He'd conquered the East, from Syria to the Caucasus. 3 triumphs he'd celebrated. The Senate called him Magnus, the Great. But that greatness was past. 2 decades since his last real battle. While Caesar perfected his art, Pompey had become politician, negotiator, not warrior. The forces reflected this dynamic. Caesar commanded 30,000 infantry, organized in 11 understrength legions. Each legion should have 5,000 men, but is averaged barely 2,700. Hungry, yes. Exhausted, definitely. But also hardened into pure steel. His cavalry was laughable. Barely 1,000 riders, many recruited Gauls. On paper, it was inadequate force to face what Pompey had assembled. Pompey commanded 45,000 well-fed, rested, confident infantry. 11 full legions, reinforced by auxiliaries from across the eastern Mediterranean. Cretan archers, Rhodian slingers, Thracian peltasts. But his true advantage was cavalry. 7,000 riders. These weren't recruited barbarians, but the flower of Roman and allied Eastern aristocracy. Young nobles who'd trained since childhood. Men like Labienus, who knew Caesar's tactics intimately from years serving under him in Gaul. The terrain at Pharsalus seemed designed for cavalry. Wide, flat plains, perfect for massive charges. A small river, the Enipeus, protected one flank. Low hills on the other side. But mostly open space where superior numbers could deploy completely. Pompey had chosen well. Here, his cavalry could envelop any flank, attack the Caesarian rear, cause the chaos that wins battles. If this epic rivalry between Rome's 2 greatest generals is captivating you, wait for what's coming. Hit that like button, subscribe to Battle Depot, and ring that bell, because what Caesar does next didn't just win a battle, it redefined the art of war for the next 2,000 years. On the night of August 8th, Caesar summoned his legates to his tent. Mark Antony, his right hand. Domitius Calvinus, left-wing commander. Publius Sulla, veteran of the Gallic Wars. What Caesar revealed left them perplexed. Standard Roman formation used 3 lines. Hastati, Principes, Driaria. It had been this way for centuries. Provided depth, allowed fresh reliefs, maintained reserves. Caesar would form only 2 visible lines across most of his front. Thin, apparently vulnerable. But then he revealed his masterstroke. From his right wing, where Pompey would concentrate his massive cavalry, Caesar would extract select cohorts. 3,000 of his best legionaries would form a 4th line, completely hidden behind his tiny cavalry. They wouldn't be in traditional legionary formation. They'd be spaced out, mobile, armed not just with gladi, but with pila, the Roman javelins used unconventionally. When their cavalry charges, Caesar explained with that unsettling calm preceding his boldest strikes. Our cavalry will yield. It will look like panic. We'll draw them in deep. Then the fourth line emerges. They won't throw the pila. They'll use them as thrusting spears, aiming high. Mark Antony understood first. Their faces, Caesar nodded. Vain aristocrats. Their faces are their pride, their identity, their political future. When they see spears aimed at their eyes, they won't think of glory. They'll think of scars, of disfigurement. They'll run. It was military psychology in its purest form. Caesar had spent a decade studying enemies. He knew aristocratic cavalry weren't professional warriors like his legionaries. They were young nobles playing at war. Faced with ugly death and permanent disfigurement, their courage would evaporate. On the morning of August 9th, as sun rose over Thessaly, Caesar prepared the most ingenious trap of his career. August 9th, 48 BC dawned clear and hot over the plains of Pharsalus. No fog, no excuses, nowhere to hide. Just two Roman armies preparing to tear each other apart under Greece's merciless sun. Horns sounded at dawn. Legions began forming in their positions. The air vibrated with the metallic sound of 75,000 men preparing to kill. This would be the day that decided who would rule the known world. Caesar formed his legions with surgical precision. His left wing, commanded by Mark Antony, faced the Enipeus River. 10 cohorts of veterans who'd fought from Britannia to the Rhine. The center, under Domitius Calvinus, contained his most numerous but less experienced legions. There he placed depth, 3 full lines. But his right wing, where he positioned the 10th Legion under Publius Sulla, looked dangerously thin. Only 2 visible lines. A commander observing from above would think Caesar had made a fatal mistake. But behind those 2 lines, completely hidden from enemy view, waited the 4th line. 3,000 select legionaries, the best soldiers from the best legions. Men who'd survived Alesia, who'd crossed the Rubicon, who would kill and die for Caesar without hesitation. They weren't in standard formation. They were spaced out, mobile, each holding his pilum not to throw, but to thrust like a spear. And they waited for their general's signal. Pompey, watching from his position, smiled, seeing Caesar's formation. His right wing looked weak, protected by barely 1,000 pathetic cavalry. There, he said to Labienus, his cavalry commander. There's his weak point. Crush his cavalry, envelope his flank, attack his rear. The battle will end in an hour. Labienus, who knew Caesar's tactics from years of joint service, nodded with arrogant confidence. 7,000 riders against 1,000. It was simple mathematics, guaranteed victory. The Pompeian cavalry was magnificent in appearance. Young Roman aristocrats in polished armor. Eastern allies in silks and gold. Each rode the finest horses money could buy. They'd trained for this moment their entire lives. Military glory was the path to cursus honorum, the Roman political career. A victory here meant future consulships, triumphs, statues. They thought of glory, not death. Around 9 a.m., Pompey gave the order. Horns sounded along his line. 45,000 men began advancing slowly. His infantry moved in perfect formation, shields raised, spears pointing forward. But Pompey had given a strange order to his infantry. Don't charge. Hold firm. Let Caesar exhaust his men running toward them. It was conservative, defensive tactics. It wasn't the Pompey who'd conquered the East decades earlier. But his cavalry had no such restrictions. 7,000 riders began trotting, then galloping, heading directly toward Caesar's weak right flank. The sound was deafening, a thunder of hooves that made the earth tremble. Dust clouds rose behind them. From distance, they looked unstoppable, an avalanche of flesh and steel heading toward their defenseless prey. Caesar's small cavalry force, outnumbered 7-1, did exactly what was expected. After a brief exchange of javelins and skirmishes, they began retreating. Not in total panic, but steadily yielding ground. The Pompeian riders, seeing easy victory, pressed harder. "We have them!" they shouted. "They flee like cowards!" The pursuit intensified. More and more Pompeian cavalry compressed into that flank, pushing each other in their rush to seize glory. At Pompeian command, the senatorial generals were practically celebrating. "You see," exclaimed one, "Caesar is finished. His cavalry flees. In minutes we'll be at his rear." Another was already discussing how they'd divide Caesar's properties after his execution. Pompey, more cautious, still watched. Something about Caesar's retreat seemed too orderly. But the moment had passed for doubts. The Pompeian cavalry had now completely enveloped Caesar's flank. They were turning to attack the 10th Legion's rear. Legionaries in the first two lines could hear hooves approaching from behind. Some looked nervously over their shoulders. But centurions shouted orders. "Eyes front! Trust Caesar!" Discipline kept lines firm, though every man knew cavalry at the rear meant massacre. Caesar, mounted on his characteristic horse with split toes, watched with supernatural calm. His officers looked at him anxiously. "Sire," asked one. "When?" Caesar raised his hand, waiting. Enemy cavalry was now fully committed, bunched in dense mass, no room to maneuver. They'd swallowed the bait completely. Then Caesar dropped his arm sharply. Trumpets sounded the signal. And suddenly, behind the retreating Caesarian cavalry, emerged something Pompeians had never seen. 3,000 legionaries appearing like ghosts, pila raised not to throw, but to thrust directly forward, aimed at riders' faces. What happened in the next minutes defied centuries of Roman military doctrine. Caesar's fourth line hit the Pompeian cavalry like a hammer against crystal. But it wasn't traditional charge. The legionaries advanced in open formation, each man with space to move, each pilum aimed high. Caesar had given specific, brutally simple instructions. Aim for the faces, not shields, not bodies, faces. It was military psychology converted into lethal weapon. The Pompeian riders, mostly young Roman aristocrats, saw iron points aimed directly at their eyes. They weren't prepared for this. In traditional cavalry combat, wounds came from swords, from arrows, blows a man could survive with honor. But seeing a 7-foot spear aimed directly at your face, threatening to pierce your eyes, destroy your nose, permanently disfigure the features defining your social identity, that was different. That was primal terror. The panic was instant and contagious. The first riders tried turning their mounts sharply, but they were bunched in dense mass, no room to maneuver. Horses collided. Riders fell. Those behind, not seeing what caused the panic, only saw their comrades fleeing and assumed disaster. Within seconds, 7,000 riders became a terrified mob pushing each other in desperation to escape those spears aimed at their faces. Labienus, the Pompeian commander, screamed orders nobody heard. "Form ranks, hold position." But it was useless. Rome's cavalry elite, men who'd boasted of their courage, fled like frightened rabbits. Some abandoned their horses and ran on foot. Others galloped blindly in any direction that wasn't toward those cursed spears. The 7-to-1 superiority evaporated in less than 5 minutes. Caesar didn't waste a second. As soon as enemy cavalry broke, he released his own cavalry in pursuit. 1,000 riders against 7,000 would normally be suicidal. But 1,000 pursuing 7,000 in panic is massacre. Caesarian riders cut down fugitives like hunters after deer. More important, the fourth line was now free. And Caesar gave them new orders. Turn, attack their infantry's flank. Pompey's plan disintegrated before his eyes. His powerful cavalry, the force meant to win the battle, had vanished from the field. Worse still, 3,000 veteran Caesarian legionaries were now attacking his infantry's exposed flank. The Pompeian legions, which had maintained firm formation waiting for Caesar to exhaust himself attacking from front, suddenly faced threat from the side. And Roman infantry, though disciplined, wasn't designed for flank combat. Mark Antony, seeing enemy cavalry's collapse, ordered general advance on the left wing. Caesar's 10th Legion, screaming their characteristic war cry, charged the Pompeian center. Now, Pompey faced pressure from 3 directions: front, flank, and his routing cavalry was causing chaos at his rear. The Pompeian formation, so perfect at start, began fracturing. Pompeian units closest to the attacked flank tried turning to face the threat, but that broke their cohesion with neighboring units. Gaps appeared in the line. Caesar's veterans, with wolves' instinct for weakness, lunged at those gaps. Hand-to-hand combat erupted along the entire line. Glad he found flesh. Wounded men's screams mixed with centurions' orders. Dust was so dense, men fought almost blind. But the critical difference was experience. Caesar's legionaries had fought 100 battles. They instinctively knew how to maintain formation under pressure, how to relieve each other, how to exploit every enemy mistake. The Pompeian legions, though well-trained, lacked that temper forged in real combat. When their formation started disintegrating, they didn't know how to recover it. Pompey, from his command position, watched disaster unfold in real time. His cavalry had fled. His flank was collapsing. His center was under unsustainable pressure. Men began fleeing individually, then in groups, then in waves. Panic's contagion spread like fire. For the first time in his legendary career, Pompey the Great faced total and irreversible defeat. Then he did something unthinkable for a Roman commander. He left the battlefield. Without giving final orders, without trying to rally his troops, he simply turned his horse and rode toward his camp. Some say he muttered, "The gods have abandoned me." Others that he was in catatonic shock. What's undisputable is that the supreme commander abandoned his army at the most critical moment. Without leadership, without direction, Pompeian resistance collapsed completely. What followed was massacre, not battle. Caesarian legionaries, their blood hot from victory, showed no mercy. Pompeians trying to surrender were executed. Those fleeing were pursued and cut down. Caesar had given orders to capture Roman citizens alive when possible, but in combat's chaos, those orders were frequently ignored. By noon, 3 hours after start, the field was covered with dead. Numbers tell the story of unprecedented catastrophe. Ancient sources, probably exaggerated but indicative, claim 15,000 Pompeian dead. Modern estimates suggest between 6,000 and 10,000. Caesarian losses, barely 200 dead, perhaps 1,000 wounded. The ratio was obscene, evidence of total collapse rather than balanced combat. Pompey had arrived with advantage in everything. He departed defeated, humiliated, destroyed. Pharsalus's consequences shook the Roman world to its foundations. That same night, Caesar took the Pompeian camp without resistance. What he found there revealed the arrogance that had destroyed Pompey. Tents decorated with Persian tapestries, tables prepared with elaborate banquets. The senatorial generals had been so certain of victory, they'd already arranged their celebration. Caesar, observing that luxury while his men still ate starvation rations, reportedly said, "This is what they wanted. This is why they betrayed Rome." Pompey fled that night with barely a handful of followers. The man who'd been Rome's greatest general rode as fugitive through Greece. His destination was Egypt, where he hoped to find refuge with young King Ptolemy III, whom Pompey had helped years before. But politics knows no gratitude. When Pompey's ship reached Egyptian shores on September 28th, Ptolemy's advisors decided a dead Pompey was more valuable than a living one. As he rode toward the beach, he was stabbed from behind. His head was cut off and presented to Caesar as a gift when he arrived days later. Caesar, upon seeing his former ally and son-in-law's head, reportedly wept. Ancient sources describe him turning away in horror. He ordered Pompey's body cremated with full honors. Was it political acting or genuine remorse? Nobody knows. But what's certain is that with Pompey dead, the senatorial opposition had lost its central figure. The civil war would continue for years more, but the outcome was already decided. Caesar returned to Rome as absolute conqueror. The Senate, terrified and without options, named him dictator. First temporarily, then for 10 years, finally for life. The Roman Republic, that system of rotating magistracies and shared power that had lasted 5 centuries, was dead. In its place was born something new, one man's domination. The Roman Empire, though that title would come later, began on the plains of Pharsalus. But why did Caesar's tactic work so perfectly? The genius lay in understanding human psychology. Aristocratic cavalry weren't professional soldiers willing to die. They were young politicians seeking glory. Faced with permanent disfigurement, their survival instinct overcame their training. Caesar converted their vanity into weapon against them. Additionally, his fourth line represented revolutionary innovation, a mobile reserve specifically designed for a unique purpose. It was tactical adaptation in real time. The battle demonstrated principles transcending its era. Concentration of force at the decisive point, economy of means, keeping the rest of the line thin but functional, immediate exploitation of successes, giving enemy no time to recover, use of reserves not as passive backup but as offensive weapon at the critical moment. These concepts are taught in military academies to this day. Compared to other decisive battles, Pharsalus stands out for its elegance. Hannibal's Cannae was more complete in annihilation. Alexander's Gaugamela was larger in scale. But Pharsalus demonstrated that simple tactical innovation, perfectly executed, can overcome any numerical advantage. Caesar didn't reinvent warfare. He simply saw a weakness nobody else had noticed and exploited it without mercy. Pharsalus's military legacy endured centuries. The idea of specialized mobile reserves became standard doctrine. Commanders from Napoleon to Rommel studied how Caesar concentrated superior force at the decisive point while maintaining economy in other sectors. The psychological lesson that morale and confidence matter as much as numbers resonated through the ages. But victory contained tragic irony. Pharsalus made Caesar invincible, untouchable, essentially divine in his army's eyes. This adoration fed fatal arrogance. When he returned to Rome as perpetual dictator, he began acting like king in everything but name. He accepted divine honors. He scorned republican traditions. Senators who'd fled with Pompey were pardoned, but humiliated. Caesar became careless, believing himself above danger. 4 years after Pharsalus, on March 15, 44 BC, the Ides of March, Caesar was stabbed 23 times in the theater of Pompey. The irony was perfect, murdered in a building named for the man he'd destroyed. The conspirators thought they were saving the Republic. In reality, they only ensured its final death. Civil wars would continue another decade until Octavian, Caesar's grandnephew, emerged as Augustus, the first official emperor. If this epic tale of tactical genius and human tragedy has fascinated you, I need you to do something. Hit that like button, subscribe to Battle Depot, and leave a comment telling me which country you're watching from. And if you want more stories where innovation overcomes numbers, where one moment of brilliance changes the world's destiny, explore our other videos. In 3 hours, Julius Caesar didn't just win a battle. He conquered Rome's destiny, destroyed the Republic, and birthed an empire that would last 1,000 years. Pharsalus proved that when tactical genius, bold innovation, and psychological understanding unite, superior numbers become irrelevant. 30,000 defeated 45,000 because their commander saw what others couldn't imagine and had the courage to stake everything on one decisive moment. The sun that had revealed Caesar's triumph now set over a field transformed into hell on earth. As darkness fell on August 9th, 48 BC, the true cost of genius became visible. Bodies carpeted the ground from Pharsalus plains to Pompey's abandoned camp. The wounded, Caesarian and Pompeian alike, screamed for water, for their mothers, for death. Medical corps, overwhelmed by sheer numbers, worked through the night by torchlight. This was the price of tactical perfection. Caesarian centurion Asinius Pollio left us his account. We walked among the dead and dying. Men who'd been our brothers in arms before the Civil War now lay in their blood. I saw a Pompeian soldier, couldn't have been more than 19, clutching a letter from home. His last thought was of family he'd never see again. These weren't statistics. These were sons, fathers, brothers. Glory always demands payment in flesh. Pompeian officer Marcus Favonius, who survived the disaster, wrote, "The moment our cavalry broke, I knew Rome herself had broken. These weren't barbarians defeating us. These were Romans killing Romans with efficiency we'd perfected conquering the world." I watched the Republic die on those plains, trampled under legionary boots. His words captured what Pharsalus truly meant: the end of an era, the death of a dream. The morning of August 10th brought grim reality. Local Thessalian peasants pressed into service spent weeks burying bodies. Mass graves were dug across the battlefield. Pompeian dead, Caesarian dead, all went into the same earth. Ancient sources claim the stench could be smelled for miles. Wolves and vultures fed for months. Some historians estimate the total dead and wounded on both sides approached 20,000 men, an entire generation of Roman military leadership destroyed in 3 hours. Caesar toured the battlefield that morning, accompanied by his marshals. His face, usually so animated, was pale and drawn. "What a waste," he reportedly said, gesturing at the carnage. "These men should have been conquering Parthia with me, not dying here." He ordered extra rations for wounded Pompeians, medical treatment regardless of allegiance. It was the least he could do for men he'd once called countrymen. The political aftermath moved swiftly. Senators who'd fled with Pompey faced terrible choices: continue hopeless resistance, surrender to Caesar's mercy, or disappear into exile. Many chose surrender. Caesar, showing calculated clemency, pardoned most. This Clementia Caesaris, Caesar's mercy, became famous. But it was also political genius. By forgiving enemies, he appeared magnanimous while ensuring they owed him everything. Former opponents became his most loyal supporters out of gratitude and fear. Cato the Younger, Pompey's most ideological supporter, refused all pardons. He fled to North Africa with remaining Republican forces. When finally cornered at Utica in 46 BC, rather than accept Caesar's mercy, he committed suicide by disemboweling himself. Ancient sources describe him pulling out his own intestines after his first attempt was stopped. His death became the ultimate statement: better death than life under tyranny. Cato became martyred symbol of republican virtue. For soldiers who survived Pharsalus, the battle became defining moment of their lives. Veterans on both sides would begin stories with, "At Pharsalus, I." Caesarian soldiers received unprecedented honors: land grants in Italy, bonuses from captured Pompeian treasury. Most importantly, the privilege of having served in the campaign that won the Civil War. Their sons and grandsons would boast of it for generations. The battlefield itself became contested ground of memory. Within years, locals reported seeing ghostly armies refighting the battle on anniversary nights. Travelers claimed hearing phantom war cries. Whether supernatural or psychological, Pharsalus had scarred the land itself. Even today, archaeologists find artifacts, arrowheads, coins, fragments of armor, silent witnesses to Rome's fratricidal fury. Modern military historians conducting staff rides still walk the Pharsalus battlefield, though exact location remains debated. They trace Caesar's fourth-line position, analyze cavalry approach angles, debate whether Pompey could have won with different tactics. The consensus? Probably not. Caesar had read his opponent perfectly and prepared the perfect counter to every move. Perhaps the most poignant aftermath involved ordinary soldiers recognizing shared humanity. Caesarian guards shared wine with wounded Pompeians. Surgeons treated enemy wounded. In the days after battle, before prisoners were dispersed, there were moments of compassion amid catastrophe. Old friendships from before the Civil War briefly resurfaced. Men who'd served together in Gaul or Spain embraced before parting forever. Pharsalus proved that even perfect victory comes with terrible cost. Caesar won everything militarily and politically, but the 200 Caesarian families who received death notifications didn't celebrate. The widows and orphans created by 3 hours of combat would never see glory, only absence. That's the lesson military academies rarely teach. Behind every tactical masterpiece lie thousands of personal tragedies. The genius that changed history was built on foundation of broken bodies and shattered lives.